"Your kid's in the fridge," the grubby little girl blurted out to the millionaire searching for the missing body. They raced to the mansion's kitchen, and when they yanked open the antique icebox, they unearthed a shocking secret. Comment, rate my story from 0 to 10. Your feedback is vital. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on you. The scream sliced through the humid afternoon air of Harmony Creek like a razor, echoing off the cobblestone streets at precisely 3 o'clock. Widowed entrepreneur Silas Blackwood, 52, almost dropped his coffee mug as he turned from his luxury condo window. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been emanating from the old clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow two-story building with peeling blue shutters that stood in stark contrast to the modern elegance of his building. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to his work. As the owner of the largest construction firm in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to steer clear of other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Ever since losing his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to revisit. His fortune, accumulated through savvy investments in the stock market, allowed him to live comfortably in that penthouse with a premium view. But money had never filled the void left by her death. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, 4-year-old Maisie huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her few years insufficient to grasp why her aunt detested her so. Her aunt, Bethany, 38, gripped a metal spoon she'd heated on the gas stove. Her eyes, bloodshot from the beer she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar, fixed on the little girl trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," Bethany hissed, her voice slurred from the booze. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the child's small arm, leaving a red welt that joined the other scars dotting her thin limbs. Maisie bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She'd learned that screams only enraged Bethany further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The child closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's gentle voice singing that lullaby before sleep. It was all that remained of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Quit your snivelling," Bethany grunted, tossing the spoon into the sink like it was the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smear those walls with that filthy charcoal again, you'll learn what real punishment is." Maisie scurried to the small room in the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old twin bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up under the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. Silas stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it while cooking, a folk tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was slightly ajar, and from there came that child's voice, shaky but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the clapboard house, retired schoolteacher Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, 61, was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike Silas, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. How strange, she thought, observing the windows of the clapboard house, a family she had known for decades. Bethany had always been troubled, but ever since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had shifted in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other kids in Harmony Creek. Mrs. Ainsworth wiped her hands on her apron and made a decision. The following morning, she would pay a social call on her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had spoken properly with Bethany, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little orphan better. Meanwhile, Silas remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The song had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident with his wife. The employee was a kind woman, always humming as she organized the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply vanished from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding Harmony Creek as Maisie finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers gripped the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, Silas closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had shifted that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over Harmony Creek, but the echo of that child's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years fleeing his responsibilities and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child's suffering. Neither of them imagined that their lives were about to become irreversibly intertwined, forever changing the fate of a girl who knew only pain. The following morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of Harmony Creek awakening for another day. Mrs. Ainsworth put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her in peace, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. Bethany opened the door with a puffy face and bloodshot eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning, Mrs. Ainsworth said with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a social call. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." Bethany hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Ainsworth, It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." Mrs. Ainsworth stepped forward, forcing Bethany to retreat. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I hear she's an adorable little girl." Bethany's face hardened for an instant before she forced a weak smile. She's sick. High fever. Better not get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. Mrs. Ainsworth pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," Mrs. Ainsworth persisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 kids, you know how it is." No, Bethany replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just the flu. She'll get over it soon." Mrs. Ainsworth noted Bethany's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, Silas watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams, where a child's voice mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw Mrs. Ainsworth at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity washed over him. Mrs. Ainsworth finally said goodbye to Bethany, but not before casting an inquisitive glance into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the clapboard house, Bethany slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found Maisie crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height wouldn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" Bethany growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt Bethany," Maisie murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" Bethany laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." Maisie went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree. There she sat on the dirt and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. It was always birds, small ones, big ones, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. Bethany had locked the back door, leaving the child in the yard under the hot midday sun. Maisie began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached Silas's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He grabbed his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while she worked. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The person who always spoke fondly about her little girl, a girl named... Her name was exactly the same as the child suffering across the street. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child suffering in the clapboard house was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? Silas put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his former employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, his former employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock sharp, the screams started again. This time, Silas didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the clapboard house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He grabbed his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. Bethany was holding something in her hands. It appeared to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently toward a small figure he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time Silas couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His financial investments and his wealth in assets meant nothing in the face of that child's suffering. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, Maisie slept on the floor of the backyard, where Bethany had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent request to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, Silas couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since he lost his wife. His capital accumulated over the years could solve many problems, but first he needed to find the courage to face his own past failures. 3 days had passed since Silas discovered Maisie's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, Mrs. Ainsworth made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and they were all present in the clapboard house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to Bethany, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the location with the best view of the backyard of the clapboard house. What she saw horrified her. Maisie was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by evident burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that Mrs. Ainsworth recognized as birds. "My God!" the schoolteacher whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. Maisie raised her eyes and saw the lady observing her. For a moment the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to Mrs. Ainsworth's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," Maisie said in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetheart," Mrs. Ainsworth responded, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The child glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine, I'm just drawing birds." "How lovely. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," Maisie replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke Mrs. Ainsworth's heart. At that moment, Bethany's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Maisie, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything Mrs. Ainsworth needed to know. The girl stood up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the schoolteacher with an expression that screamed for help. Mrs. Ainsworth remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to Bethany's voice. Everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, Silas had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the backyard of the clapboard house partially, and the sight of the marks on Maisie's arms made him queasy. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, Mrs. Ainsworth made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress, took a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed to the clapboard house again. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. Bethany answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's persistence. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before Bethany could protest, Mrs. Ainsworth had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," Bethany lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a pity. Maybe another time then," Mrs. Ainsworth said, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen. A muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Mrs. Ainsworth and Bethany froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," Bethany said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. Mrs. Ainsworth smiled and nodded, but had decided she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything. Anything at all." Mrs. Ainsworth's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the schoolteacher left, Bethany slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found Maisie huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing Mrs. Ainsworth's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," Bethany accused, her eyes already gleaming with the familiar fury. "No, Aunt Bethany, I didn't make noise," the girl protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to herself. Bethany grabbed the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" Bethany hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions. You think I can't take care of you?" Across the street, Silas had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His investments in bitcoins and his passive income from funds meant nothing if he couldn't protect an innocent child. While Maisie suffered another episode of systematic torture, Silas made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, Bennett Graham. "Bennett, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life." That night, after Bethany fell asleep drunk on the living room couch, Maisie managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The retired teacher had decided she could no longer stand idly by, and across the street, a wealthy man was finally finding the courage to use his fortune in a meaningful way. The stars shone over Harmony Creek, silent witnesses to a child who still believed in miracles, even when everything around her seemed to conspire against her happiness. Bennett arrived at Silas's apartment on Friday morning with a serious expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at university almost 3 decades ago, and Bennett knew well the emotional isolation his friend had built after the loss of his wife. That's why the urgent call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," Bennett said, sitting down in the apartment's spacious living room. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." Silas poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who cares for her. Mistreated how? Bennett asked, taking a notepad from his briefcase. Burns, daily screams, neglect. Silas paused, struggling with the words. I have recordings, evidence of what's happening. Bennett was silent for a moment, processing the information. This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I know, Silas replied, running his hands over his face. But there's something else. My former employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident with my wife. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible, Bennett completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. Silas nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Bennett could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. This happens every day, he asked, horrified. At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too, Silas replied, grabbing his cell phone. Do you want to see the recordings? Bennett watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's office. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately. While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, Maisie was living another day of terror. Bethany had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early hours. How many times do I have to tell you not to smear the walls? Bethany shouted, grabbing the girl by the arm, hard enough to leave marks. You're a plague, a curse on this house. The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. You're going to stay locked in the room until I decide what to do with you, Bethany continued, pushing the girl down the hallway. And if I hear a sound, you're going to know a punishment you've never experienced before. The room where the child was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired schoolteacher heard when she passed by the clapboard house on her way to the market. Mrs. Ainsworth had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the mark she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. Mrs. Ainsworth stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that made the educator's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the market, Mrs. Ainsworth headed directly to the city centre, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. I need to talk to you about a very serious situation, Mrs. Ainsworth said, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker looked up from the papers she was analyzing. Mrs. Ainsworth, how good to see you. What brings you here today? A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated. The caseworker straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and Mrs. Ainsworth wasn't the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," the caseworker said, grabbing a complaint form. While Mrs. Ainsworth related her observations across town, Bennett was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The district attorney listened attentively as Bennett presented the evidence collected by Silas. "This is compelling evidence," the DA said, examining the videos on Bennett's cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" Bennett asked, concerned. "With this evidence?" "We can act today," the DA replied. "I'll contact Child Protective Services now." It was thus that, by a coincidence that would change Maisie's fate, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The caseworker was finishing writing down Mrs. Ainsworth's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services speaking. This is the district attorney. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." The caseworker paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by chance the yellow clapboard house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," the caseworker replied, looking at Mrs. Ainsworth with surprise. 2 independent sources. This confirms the severity of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being assembled. The caseworker, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court bailiff, was heading to the clapboard house. Mrs. Ainsworth had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. Silas watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Bennett was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change Maisie's life forever. "You did the right thing," Bennett said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the clapboard house. At the house, Bethany had gone out to buy alcohol at the local dive bar, leaving Maisie locked in the stuffy room. The girl kept singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the caseworker knocked on the door of the clapboard house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and evident signs of neglect in every room. It was Mrs. Ainsworth who first heard the faint voice coming from the back room. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found Maisie curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetheart," the caseworker said, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Evelyn. We've come to help you." The girl looked at Mrs. Ainsworth, recognizing the kind lady who had spoken with her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Bethany will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," Mrs. Ainsworth said, reaching out her hand to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the child was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear. But her journey was just beginning, and across the street, a wealthy man was finally discovering that his true wealth wasn't in his financial assets, but in the ability to make a difference in the life of an innocent child. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you daily videos that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.